Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending upon where you are in the world, and welcome to today's DevOps.com webinar. I'm Charlene O'Hanlon, moderator for today's event, and I welcome you. As always, we have a great webinar on tap, but before we get started, we do have a few housekeeping items we need to go over. First of all, today's event is being recorded, so if you miss any or all of the event, you will be able to access it on demand. Following today's event, we will be sending out an email that contains a link to access the webinar on demand. And we are taking questions from the audience. So if at any time you have a question for our speaker today, please don't wait, don't hesitate, just use your GoToWebinar control panel and submit your question. And we'll try to get to as many as we can before the end of today's presentation. And finally, we are going to be doing a gift card drawing today. We're going to be drawing 3 lucky winners of $50 Amazon gift cards. So please stick around until the end of today's presentation, and we'll be doing that random drawing at that point. And with that, we'll go ahead and kick off today's webinar, which is Achieve Intelligent Test Execution, Strategies for Streamlining Regression Testing and Delivering Higher Business Value. Our speaker today is Adam Satterfield, who is Director of Testing and Quality at Anthem. Hi, Adam. Thanks for joining me today.
Sure, thanks. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to everyone today.
Excellent. Well, I'm going to put myself on mute and let you get right into your presentation.
Excellent. Well, thanks everyone for taking some time out of your busy schedules to listen to a good talk around how we can bridge the gap in testing that oftentimes can occur between the business, IT, and the testing teams. So first, as we get into it, if you're in the West Coast, San Francisco area, definitely stop on by. We've got a good conference here in the end of May. I'll be speaking there, so would love to meet you in person and get to know and have a conversation with you. So the agenda today, we're going to talk a bit about how disconnects can cause inefficiencies in testing, what intelligent execution really is and how it can be useful, and how we really get the most out of that efficiency by leveraging conversations and technology. And as was mentioned before, we'll have plenty of time at the end for some Q&A. So if you have questions as we go through this, please don't hesitate to ask. Would love to get into a conversation with you about this. I always like to start my talks with a quote. This one I love about communication because it's so true. So many times we have the opportunity to move the ball forward and clear up confusion in testing simply by having a conversation. It seems like such a small thing to do, but oftentimes it provides a major benefit. And in my years that I've been working on this, transitioning teams and working with teams moving from Waterfall to Agile onto DevOps, trying new technology stacks, moving from monolith applications to microservices. One of the big things I've seen is that a disconnect happens between the business, leadership, and IT that causes inefficiencies in testing. To have a truly highly successful testing team, we need to solidify the partnership between the business and the technical side. The quality team can oftentimes be the brokers of this partnership because testing and quality doesn't just matter to a QA role, it matters to everyone. And many times the business, be it your users, your UAT, your sales, marketing, product owners, they can oftentimes hold the keys to understanding what is needed to test when. So as you can see on the page here, we have a common test pyramid. So that obviously was a little bit of a joke. What we like to say here is one of the things that we miss in understanding and taking a look at the test pyramid is it actually causes a disconnect. Leaders oftentimes, or executives oftentimes see UI at the very top of the test pyramid. So imagine, if you will, you're in the desert, you're looking for a great pyramid, and essentially you see this mirage of all these different types of tests that are just swirling in the sands. So if we think about it that way, where the test pyramid isn't some monolith structure that we must follow, and UI tests have the least priority. When we think about it that way, it's a way to think about the test that can incorrectly send us down the wrong path. So one of the things that we want to do is we want to have priority-based tests. We want to ensure that if we need optimal tests to match the speed of the releases, we can't just rely on a simple structure like unit tests, we have to run all of them. UI tests, we have a limited set that may be fragile, so let's stay away from them. We needed to look at our testing in a much more intelligent way. While the testing pyramid has served us, well in the past, as we look forward, we have much more data and information to make much more intelligent observations and ways to move forward with our testing. So what is intelligent execution? It's one of the good ways that we can get around the disconnect between the business, IT, and the leaders in the organization. So simply put, this is using information that we're gathering to help us determine at a moment's notice which tests are the most efficient to run to get us the most understanding of risk. And risk is really a big word here, because risk is going to allow the business, or the understanding of risk is going to allow the business to be comfortable with the quality of product being shipped to the customer. So the focus here is going to be on priority-based tests, and this is something that we're really going to focus in on in the talk today, is how do you get to understand priority-based tests? Because really it's going to be that intelligent execution, which oftentimes is the technology piece of it, plus your priority-based tests, which is going to be understanding which tests are the most valuable pieces to run that is going to give you your highest value. And I like to use this priority-based method because oftentimes, as and we'll talk about this here in a little while from the move from Waterfall to Agile, but oftentimes even in Agile, QA teams are crunched. So the question comes up, what should I run in the time that I'm given? So as we're thinking about this, obviously test automation is a big point here. So obviously the whole point of test automation, other than rapid feedback, is to free up testers to focus on complex tests that have either a high fragility or a high cost to automate. So we don't want to automate them, but we still need to have a way to run them. A good example here is, obviously the UI can be notoriously difficult to maintain. A lot of times to automate the UI can actually be relatively simple, but to maintain it as we're making changes, as we're moving the product forward, it has a high level of maintainability. So one of the things is, as you're thinking about this UI test, oftentimes leaders like to shy away from this. They say, hey, let's not really focus on those because they are so fragile. But the disconnect that happens here is the business relies on those UI tests. They like to see those UI tests because it really speaks to them, because they can actually see a simulated user path through the system, and that lets them know whether something is working or not. So again, thinking back to the automation, the testing pyramid, while UI is at the top, understanding that we should have a good foundation of unit and functional integration tests, UI itself is still very, very important. And that's part of the reason why we had the image of the Mirage, is to kind of break that image apart and say UI is very important. It's important to your business and it's important to your leadership. So let's not forget it. So thinking about that and understanding that that is something that's important, how do we actually have this conversation to move it forward to understand these? So again, besides obviously intelligent execution is something that we're hearing a lot of in the market right now. There's a lot of buzz surrounding to it. So really what we like to say with intelligent execution is, how to most efficiently and effectively execute your tests such that it makes sense for the business and your company. So the way that we're going to do this, and some of the things we're going to talk about, is by having conversations. We want to have conversations with the business, with the developers, with the leaders, to really drive us and understand the strategies for how we can get to a priority-based test suite. So we highlighted this a little bit earlier in the opening. You should never underestimate the value of simply having a conversation. If we think about the most efficient way to understand risk is to have a conversation. Is whether you're a virtual team, whether you are a team that is located in a central location, having a conversation through words, not necessarily even through email, will allow you to understand the other person's point of view a lot better, so you can understand what the risk is. So driving into the business piece of that, well, one of the things that we want to do is we want to prioritize these conversations with the business at the outset of the project. I've seen with a lot of teams moving to Agile and adopting Agile that testers wait to ask business critical questions until after the sprint starts, as they're working on their acceptance test then at that point, or only really once things start going sideways. It's better to have these conversations up front. You're going to mitigate the risk of having a large issue in the end by having these conversations up front. Plus, with the information that you have a better decision on what to test. One of the key things we like to see come out of this is something we call highest business value tests, or HBVs for short. And essentially what a highest business value test is it's a test that the business finds the most critical, i.e., if this test or if this path was not working, our business couldn't function. It would be something like bill pay, user login, the actual critical pieces. And so many times we see testers jump right in and start validating the sprint functionality, and they're not thinking about the highest business value test and ensuring that those are covered. And that's where we get into some of the regression pieces is, do we need a massive regression suite? Or can we focus on the highest business value test first and move forward from there? So in an Agile environment, conversations are absolutely critical, but they are still often overlooked. And one of the reasons we've seen is for those teams who have moved from Waterfall to Agile, where you're used to having potentially an 80-page requirements document, you didn't typically have these conversations. It was very siloed. It was very stepped. In Agile now, we're down to typically 2 or 3 lines of user stories. You have your, as a, I want to, so that. So if you're not aligned up front, if you don't have those conversations to truly understand the functionality and truly understand the risk and the business ask, those things are going to get lost in translation. And this is a problem that I've seen many organizations face. They may think they're doing Agile, but essentially what they're doing is mini Waterfall, where the product owner or the business analyst or the business owner actually sends over some requirements. And from there, they're handed to the developer starts to work on them, and then they hand it over to QA, and QA is actually writing and creating their tests midway through the sprint. So one of the big things that you see here is you see defects come up late in the process, or you see a big problem when QA is crushed at the end, and then they're having to understand and write their tests and figure out the functionality and try to perform their tests at the same time. So one of the big things you can do to get in front of this, I love these 2 questions. These 2 questions essentially can get you out of thinking in silos and thinking myopically when you ask the business these questions. And again, I love these. These are some of my favorite questions to ask some of our business partners or product owners. What keeps you up at night? What about this release that is going out makes you worried? If something in this release broke, what would keep us from being able to do business? And some of you may be familiar with RBT or risk-based testing. So this is a pull out from that. As a tester, if you're not familiar with risk-based testing, it's one of the top things you should go out and take a look at and learn. It will allow you to understand at any given point, how can I prioritize my test the most effective way to ensure that I'm testing the important things first, and then moving on down the list. Again, getting back to some of the highest business value, RBT is one of the #1 ways you can understand highest business value. So one of the things that you'll see here as well is the vast majority of time, what the business owner says is going to be directly related to UI and UI tests. A lot of times, the vast majority of time, your HBVs are going to be critical UI tests that you're going to need to prioritize. Again, things such as bill pay flow or user login flow. And having these conversations with the business helps you to understand the business impact, and then combine that with understanding the probability that something might happen. Now you truly understand your risk if something might go wrong. So we've talked about the business and why it's important to talk with the business, but let's not forget about the developers. Oftentimes they don't forget about us as testers, especially once we start finding issues, and then they definitely really remember us. So one of the big things here is developers are very, very important for test automation. They have a very strong skill set and under the hood knowledge of the functionality. And if we remember back to what we said before, we need a partnership between both the business and the technical sides to be truly successful. So whether you work with the cowboy coders or the code slingers or TDD experts, being able to build a bridge into development will give you the other piece of the puzzle that you may need. One of the big things we like to look at is behavior-driven development. Oftentimes teams don't necessarily think about behavior-driven development and thinking about the development team. They say, hey, isn't this just a way to elicit requirements or understand the functionality coming from the product owners? And while yes, that is true, BDD does focus on understanding the user's point of view in doing our testing. BDD, if you look deep enough into it, there are very strong communication techniques, such as having the testers drive conversations, get up, draw images, draw pictures, draw words on a whiteboard to have conversations. And a key part of BDD that I really love is one of the things they say is don't go into a sprint without having fleshed out acceptance criteria and your acceptance test. So they want you to drive having those conversations up front. But one of the things that we typically see are missed is the conversation with the developers. So it's a very strong conversation. The testers learn BDD. They drive those conversations into the business. And then from there, they understand how the business flow is supposed to work, but they don't understand how the developer is supposed to be validating it. And the developer doesn't understand how the testers are going to be testing it. So if we think about that break, that can cause a major issue. I was recently working with and coaching an agile team that was just getting into SAFe. And one of the things that we found is when we took a look at a sample user story, they had 7 acceptance criteria for that user story. And the developers assumed that those 7 acceptance criteria were all of the tests that were going to be run. But by leveraging BDD and having a conversation with the business and with the developers at the same time, we wound up finding 4 more acceptance criteria that were missed because there wasn't that communication going back and forth. And we wound up with going from 7 test cases to 40 test cases to cover those 11 acceptance criteria. And the product owners and developers both confirmed that if we had not followed that process, those would have definitely become production defects. So again, having the conversations up front, the initial time investment will actually save time in the end, and it also improves job satisfaction because we don't have many big surprises at the very end of the process. Now, this is a little bit of a different way to think for most quality teams. Most quality teams tend to stay away from unit testing reviews or code reviews. However, as a tester, I encourage you to start engaging and working in these code reviews and unit testing reviews, because you can ask questions like, how do we execute these unit tests and how do they relate to the requested functionality and user stories? If we think back to the early days of QA and the true purpose of what QA does, it is to provide information. If we think about all the testing that we ever do, essentially what it boils down to is providing information. Oftentimes that information is on risk. Is the application good enough? And does it work well enough to be put in front of our customers? And we, as the QA team or the testing team, provide that information. So if we think about the fact that we're providing information, how do we do that? So we think a little bit about the scientific method. Okay, we need to go out, we need to gather a bunch of information, collect that together, and then essentially build, a thesis statement, or, here's our project that we've worked on. So if we think about it, what are all the various avenues that we need to collect information on? Well, we need to know the business requirements or the user stories. We need to understand how the flows work, the potential impacts with the developers doing their functionality. But the unit testing is such a key piece of this, that is oftentimes overlooked, because that is the developers actually inputting test inside of the code to help you as the tester and help the business owner be confident that the functionality works as requested, at least at the unit level. One of the things that I've seen here is a couple of side benefits. We had a team where we implemented this, and what we found was it was a way for our manual testers to get a much stronger look into the code base, and it helped to make them more technical. Now that they truly understood what was happening under the hood, they were able to adjust their tests to make more sense and actually find much more, critical defects. And another thing we found is the testers and developers, by communicating with this, they actually were able to streamline the test and say, hey, we're going to validate this flow, this functionality at the unit level, this piece at the integration level, this piece at the functional level, so on and so forth. So it went away from we must have unit tests covering everything being the base of the pyramid to unit tests make sense, but how does it fit into the overall bigger picture, which is a much more important question that we needed to answer. So getting into some of the probability here. I love probability. This is just one probability theorem that's around. So for those of you who are math nerds out here, this is some pretty fun stuff. So one of the ways to look into some probability is SonarQube. If we think about code quality tools that have really good dashboards that can be actionable and workable by quality teams, SonarQube really is one of the best on the market that I like. So what I like to see is I have my testing teams go and look at the SonarQube dashboards and understand what unit tests will run where and where we may have potential code smells or high levels of technical debt. From there, we're able to point out potential problems, again, gathering information to understand risk, in the code or areas where no tests at all were run. This helped them to understand where there might be a higher level of risk in a certain area. Also, if we look at this from a big picture standpoint, it gives us a better insight into the overall level of quality from technical to business type testing. So if we think our goal is to gather information, when we go out, we gather information about the unit tests. We're also going to look at SonarQube, and that's going to provide us some information as to where those unit tests were run and potentially where we may have some other problems, so we know where we may need to focus our tests with limited time. And this is also a fun one here, and this is one that I see overlooked quite often, is the QA team saying, well, the build output is really for developers to look at. We don't really need to look at that. We're okay looking at SonarQube, we're okay doing some review, but we don't really need to know how the build output works or how even the build process works. But things are changing now. Things are changing in the market, and we're seeing that, while I don't believe, especially being in the world of healthcare, in the world of, having, truly structured tests that need manual eyes looking at it, I don't believe that manual testers are going to go away. However, one of the things that we are seeing is that manual testers are needing to become more and more technical, not from an automation standpoint necessarily, but from an understanding of your CI/CD pipeline and being able to really inject yourself in there to figure out the most efficient and effective way to do your testing. So we'll talk about this here in a minute when we get to some of the actual execution pieces. So because of that, there is a need for testers to really get in and look at the build output, and it can provide some very valuable information. Being able to review this will often provide information such as which unit tests were executed, which automation tests were executed, was anything skipped, did the build have to try over several times because it found some problems. Again, we want to remember this is all about building a better picture with more information so the testers can better prioritize their tests. So this is yet another piece of the puzzle. So now that we understand how to prioritize some of our tests, how do we translate this into actual actionable steps? This is one of my favorite ones here, test tags. There's a lot of automation frameworks that will allow you to do this, two of the ones that I really like, Serenity and Cucumber, will allow you to tag your tests. For instance, if we understand from the business that a priority for an upcoming release is a big redo of a billing page, then we can assure that as part of the build process, we execute the tests that are tagged billing first. Or if we have a regression suite that is tagged, we know that we may need to tap into that and run extra tests for those high business value tests. So no matter what suite or no matter what framework you're using, the vast majority of them do support tagging. And this is a big one, and one that I highly recommend you as a tester really get in and try to start understanding how it works. And even if you're not currently doing automation, simply tagging your manual test will allow your automation team to be able to go back and understand, once you add an automation team, which ones need to be executed first. So very powerful, very simple, but very powerful technique that oftentimes many teams overlook. I was very proud of this headline here, Get Threaded. I just have to say I really like that one a little bit. So all joking aside, this is one where if we want to really understand our CI/CD pipeline as a tester, looking at the build servers that we use, be it Jenkins or Bamboo or something else, understanding the true functionality and capabilities can help us more effectively and efficiently run our test. So one of the big things that we like to see here, and we'll go over this here in just a minute, is you can run your quick feedback test. So you've got your test tags, maybe you have several of them marked as smoke. So you're running your builds, you're doing your unit test, you're doing your integration test, and then we just want to run a simple smoke suite because we know that our regression suite can take, an hour, 2 hours, or something like that. We run our important test, and we go ahead and we pass the build on, and we let it continue building. But Jenkins has an ability to kick off another thread or concurrent build, as it's also called, to where now you can kick off your regression suite. So your testers aren't having to wait in their staging environment or their test environment to go ahead and get a hold of the functionality for the regression suite to complete. They can go ahead and start validating some of the functionality. And then if any problems come up with the regression suite, we can go back and address those later. One of the things when we implemented this is we found about 90% of the time, the large automated regression suite would not find any issues. It would pass 100% of the time. 90% of the time, it would pass 100% of the time. There we go. So we wound up having to wait 1 or 2 hours for that suite to pass before we were allowed to access the build. So we have the build and then the deploy. So before it was deployed, we were waiting on the regression suite. So essentially we said, hey, since we have a very high pass rate on this, and it's essentially the regression suite is our safety net, we need to go ahead and cut down on the amount of time that our testers are spending around wasting their time by just sitting around. If we think about an important concept in DevOps, the cycle time, this is a way that we cut out throughout a week multiple hours per tester worth of cycle time of just waiting around. So we were able to more intelligently, by implementing test tags, tag our tests. So we knew that when our build was being built and our tests were being run, it was running a smaller suite of tests that were more directed and more actionable to the code that was being changed. So we had a higher degree of understanding and a higher degree of, being able to say this build has a low level of risk because we have hit these with the various tests. And then the big automation suite, the regression suite, would run after the deploy in the background. And so we can monitor it. And if we had a problem, we could roll back. As you know, every build and deploy that we have should have a very strong rollback plan. So we have the capability to roll it back if needed, or we could say, hey, let's just go ahead and fix it and do another smaller release on top of what we have. So by doing it that way, and this was actually one of our testers that came up with this idea because they really dug into Jenkins feeling that, hey, I think there's a better way we can do this. So again, when you have tools that were typically relegated to just developers, you're missing a big opportunity as a tester to really drive the efficiency and effectiveness of your testing forward. And here's just an example of the way that we had that I was walking through. So for instance, if we want to create a new billing UI, we compile the code, we run our unit tests. Any of those fail, we go back to development, obviously. Next, we run our integration test. Highly recommend breaking apart your unit and integration test. That is something that we have seen some pretty major success with because your integration test typically will take longer. And if you think about the point of a unit test, it is for rapid feedback. So we don't want to wait on the integration test to run if we know that the underlying functionality is not working already. After our integration test, now we're going to leverage our test tags. So we're going to run our billing, our smoke, maybe our report test, and then we start our deploy process. And then from there, we go ahead using another build and we kick off our regression suite. So now we have the ability to very smartly go through the path to help us understand the level of risk and get the functionality in the hands of our testers much faster. So this is one that I'm pretty excited to talk about as well. Oftentimes we hear the term expensive test. And oftentimes things like performance testing and load testing are relegated to the background, or they're not prioritized because of the pure cost. So, and this is, again, one area that I'm seeing up and coming in testing, and it makes me very excited, is how containerization and testing can work together to get you the most effective way to deploy either your application or your test suite onto the servers with all of the libraries, all the packages, and everything that you need. So I know that if you have an opportunity to come to Star East here in the next few weeks, there are some very good talks coming up about containers and Docker. So highly recommend, do some research. There's a lot of very good YouTube videos as well, a lot of good information on understanding how containerization can truly affect test automation in a very positive way. One of the ways that we had done it at a previous place is, in AWS, for those that aren't necessarily familiar with what spot instances are, and the vast majority of the big cloud providers have a similar thing to spot instance. It essentially allows you to bid on an off-cycle or off-hour AWS instance. Most of the time it'll be EC2 or something like that. And what we found is we could replicate our staging environment that we needed to run our performance and load testing in at about 1/10 of the cost of keeping another staging environment up and running through AWS. So our testers came up with the idea to package up the microservices that were needed under test, the test suite. At that time, we were using Locust.io, and package all of these up. And using Docker, where we were able to deploy these to a spot instance, run all of our tests, we kick back the logs via Logstash, and then we were able to review them in the morning with Kibana. So through this automated process, we were actually able to find several issues in our architecture that could be fixed that we wouldn't necessarily have had the time or capabilities to run because it would have impeded all the other functionality going on in those lower environments at the time. So again, here is something that is normally relegated and put in the land of developers or DevOps engineers, and not necessarily something that testers think about. So I encourage you as a tester to take a look at a lot of the capabilities inside your CI/CD pipeline and see how you can leverage those to truly benefit the execution of your tests and make them very effective and very efficient. So getting into some of the recap here, while the testing pyramid, it is valuable. Don't get me wrong there, it is valuable, but truly understanding and speaking the language of high business value tests can help your leadership understand that the test pyramid is just a guidepost. It's not something that says UI tests are not important. UI is a very important piece of this, and oftentimes it is how the business likes to talk. And then we learned some techniques as well to streamline test execution. Really, I could go over, several talks on just this execution piece. The big thing I wanted you to understand here is what things are available to you as a tester to get out and learn that can help you run your tests most effectively. Technology is changing every day. The way that we communicate is changing every day. So being able to grasp those and understand those will definitely help you to propel your tests in a much, much farther way to have them be more effective, more efficient, and really be able to focus on those highest business values first. And with that, I would love to open it up to questions, please.
All right, great. If you have a question for Adam, please use your GoToWebinar control panel and submit your questions. We have gotten a couple of them in so far. So here's the first one. Are sonar gates progression defined by business, or is there a standard definition for each of the gates?
Yeah, that is a great question. So typically the way that I like to define the gates is to include the business. If you have a release management team or a release manager, definitely want to include the release managers and then the developers and testers. Because you don't want to set things without the developers, thoughts in it, because you could set something that looks great to the release management team and the quality team, but it's just way too strict and the developers will never be able to reach it. So typically what I like to do is we start with the SonarQube way, which is a very, very good baseline, and then try to adjust that, either up or down depending on what your organization might need. But absolutely bringing the business in to help determine those is a very good idea.
Okay, great. Next question. Can you give an example of things your team has found or things a QA team could find by looking at the build logs or build output?
Yes, absolutely. So one of them is going to be the information. So the information as to, did we actually run unit tests? So a developer can create the most beautiful unit tests in the entire world, but if they're not actually executed, then it doesn't do us any good. But the tester won't know that until looking at the build output. Also, one of the things you can find in the build output is, were there any logs in terms of, did we have any errors in the deployment? Sometimes with some build servers, they are allowed to deploy with errors, or they're allowed to deploy with warnings. And so if you don't understand what those might be, for instance, a good example here is SonarQube can hook into Jenkins. And if a team fails a quality gate, then you can either fail the build or you can just provide a warning. But that warning itself goes into the build output. So if you weren't reading that, you may not necessarily know that while Team A met their deadlines, they also introduced a very high level of technical debt.
All right, great. Let's see. Boy, we're getting a lot of questions in now. Let's see. Does the RBT approach apply to unit testing as well?
It certainly can apply to unit testing. Unit testing is such a unique thing, because if we look at the way that unit tests are actually covered or counted by SonarQube, it doesn't actually look and say, hey, is this unit test effective and is it useful? All it does is say, yes, you actually have a unit test. So you can do the RBT approach to make sure that the unit test that you're writing or that the developer is writing is actually purposeful. And so that's one reason why I definitely suggest testers get in and truly understand and ask a developer, hey, what is the purpose of this unit test? What exactly is it validating? Just to make sure that they're not just creating unit tests to make sure that they can pass a quality gate, but actually creating unit tests that will push the quality of the application forward.
Excellent. Okay, great. Guys, if you have a question for Adam, please don't wait. Yeah, you can go ahead and get it in using your GoToWebinar control panel. Our next question, was tests scattered around unit/integration/UI level, how do you track automation coverage?
That is a great question. So one of the things that we will typically do is you could use something like a Logstash, or with a Kibana interface, or a Splunk with Tableau, and essentially collect all of the various information for the coverages from your various systems. For instance, you could tap into the CenterCube database to get your unit integration test. You could tap into your automation framework, using some sort of reporting library or a plugin, or whichever framework you're using, that would send those results and the coverage results to either Logstash or Splunk or something similar, and then you could collate those reports together and essentially through the magic of Kibana or Tableau, be able to properly display the overall percentages. That's the easiest way to do it. The other way to do it is just to manually get in and create a Excel file through some Excel wizardry to do it, and just kind of go through there. But there really is, once you start combining multiple different types of frameworks together, there's not necessarily one best answer, but there are a lot of very strong and capable ways of doing it.
Okay, excellent. Okay, next question. The Agile team schema gives a lot of power to the product owner or the former business analyst. Will the QA employee be able to talk directly to business and not through the PO? If so, doesn't it change the PO role with this approach?
That's an excellent question. So the answer is sort of. It really depends on the size of your team, the size of your organization, and the business. For smaller businesses, oftentimes the PO is the business person. It's not necessarily a separate role. For much larger companies, the PO essentially is going out and meeting with the business and collecting all the information, and they are the spokesperson for the business. However, as a tester, it is our job to provide information, and if you have doubts as to the information you're getting from the product owner, there is nothing wrong with going directly to the business and saying, hey, I would love to know which tests or which functionality in our application, if it stopped working, would cause the business to go under, or would cause us a lot of money, or would cause a lot of heartache. Oftentimes the product owners won't necessarily know the answer to that one. So you can bring the product owner with you to ask those questions. But if you're trying to get very, very specific into things like that and determining the HPVs, you definitely want to talk directly to the business.
All right, great. Okay, next question. How do you overcome the challenge of having non-technical QA/testers be part of the delivery teams?
Yeah, so one of the big things that we like to do is, try to build a reasonable path to learn technical skills for non-technical testers. This is something I'm very passionate about. So one of the things that we typically see is you can start them by having them look at logs and build outputs. So they understand, I'm a tester, I perform this action in the application, and I'm looking at the log outputs, and I can immediately see the log outputs and kind of understand what the code is doing when I perform the action. From there, you can drive into, attending code reviews, understanding logic, kind of the if then else type logic to understand how code actually works under the hood, and then start, gradually progressing from there. But typically, if you have very non-technical testers, you really should provide a path forward, because, in the next 5 years or even less, they're going to be really left behind. And the only exception here would be is if they are business testers. For instance, you're pulling someone off the line of, service or call center to actually perform some level of testing. That's a little bit different. But as a tester who is a professional tester, they really should be focusing on honing those technical skills, because with the advent of a lot of these CI/CD tools, machine learning, all these things coming up, there's an absolute need to have a much higher level of technical skills than was previously required.
Okay, excellent. So let's see, we are about, just about quarter till the top of the hour. We have time for a few more questions here. Next question, based on my understanding, you are suggesting targeted regression rather than full regression against system based on specific release. Is that correct?
So I'm saying you should take a look at targeted regression to speed up the feedback cycle. There is certainly a need to have a full regression as your safety net. The one thing I want to caution people in believing is that the regression suite is where we're going to find all of our defects. You should be really surprised if your regression suite finds a defect. You really want that as your safety net. But what we want to do is we want to pull the high business value test out. And instead of calling that a regression test, it's really a business value test or a business flow test to say, we want to run these more often and, in parallel with some of our releases, but we still maybe want to have a nightly or a weekly full regression suite run. I'm more saying, let's just make sure that we are executing them, based on priority and truly understanding, is it fully needed for us to run this suite every day, every hour, every night? If the answer for your organization is yes, absolutely, then, go forward and conquer on that. But more often than not, it is something that you really can build as just a safety net and not something that is a requirement of, if we don't get this regression suite out, we're not going to be able to release.
Excellent. Okay. Next question. Who is leading the QA in the Agile team? Is it the PO or an external test architect? And if it is the PO, how can we guarantee synchronization between different Agile teams?
Yeah, typically in small to medium-sized companies, I don't necessarily see the PO ever really leading testing. Now, the PO should care about the testing. In the small teams, typically it would be the Scrum Master, oftentimes played by a development architect or development lead, who has some general oversight to ensure that tickets are being moved, that the testers are actually testing and getting their work done. In the vast majority of Agile organizations, there is a test management structure that may sit outside of the Scrum teams that essentially can provide mentoring and oversight. For larger teams or those that are experienced with SAFe, yes, it would be a test architect or someone from a system team that would be providing more oversight to the testers to make sure that the teams are communicating amongst one another and to really look at that forest through the trees to make sure that the big picture is still being taken into account.
Awesome. All right, great. So next question. I love these questions. We're getting so many good ones.
Yeah, they're great.
Yeah, they are. How should browser compatibility be treated in an intelligent execution world?
So part of it depends on what industry it is and why and how it's important to you. So if you are a app or you are something where you live and die by having the ability for customers to be able to log in, via IE, via Chrome or whatnot, then it should be very high on the priority. Now, one thing with the browser compatibility testing is this is where having conversations with the business can really help you. So you can understand, because oftentimes the business is tracking information to understand what browsers users are actually using when they visit the website. So for instance, if you're in your browser, your multi-browser testing, if you've got, Chrome, IE, Firefox, and Safari, and you must run those every single time, but your business says, hey, we only get 0.01% on Safari. Well, is that something then that you really need to run all the time? Or if 90% of our tests come through Chrome, let's make sure that we always run the Chrome test, but the IE test and Safari test can maybe be relegated to a nightly run, or that other concurrent build that gets kicked off. Maybe it's not part of the if IE stops working, it's not going to cause our business to go down. So understanding and having the communication with the business can better help you direct how to do some of that cross-browser testing.
Excellent. Okay, guys, there's still a few minutes left. So if you have any last-minute questions for Adam, please go ahead and use your GoToWebinar control panel and submit your questions, and we will move on to the next one here. How do you determine the appropriate number of HBV tests, and what kinds of parameters can you put around this to keep the number reasonable?
Yep. So this one is, again, having that conversation with the business. And now an HBV essentially is a high business value test. It is a path through the application that if it stopped working, it would cause, massive problems, if not great financial loss to the company. So, I keep going back to the billing. So for instance, if we have customers that couldn't pay their bill, that obviously is going to incur a financial loss for the company. Or if we had customers that were unable to check out if we were an e-commerce site, that causes great financial loss. So you want to keep them very focused to the core business flows of your application or your company that are absolutely critical and must work every single release. So maybe, for instance, we might break some functionality where people can't view a PDF of their bill, but they can view it on the website. So maybe that's something then that we don't want to add into the high business value test. But being able to pay your bill is absolutely something that you get in. So typically the way that we like to approach it is collect all of the feedback you get from all of the business owners, because each business owner is going to have their own point of view. And then collectively have a conversation with them and say, hey, if we were to stack rank these and we want to get to the top 10, what are the top 10 for us? And they all kind of can have that conversation together with the QA team really leading and guiding that conversation. There really is no magic number, but most often than not, you're not going to have dozens of these because your application really doesn't have dozens of critical flows. There's really only going to be a handful of critical flows that are truly, truly important to your business.
Okay, all right. Well, it looks like we have one more question here. So, if you guys have any last minute questions, go ahead and get them in now. That would be the time. Okay, the next question. Were your developers reluctant to include QA in unit test or build output reviews? If so, how did you convince them?
Yes, initially they were, but the developers also got tired of working every weekend when late breaking issues were found and they had to be fixed so their release could go out. So what they found is by having the increased collaboration and partnership up front, we were actually able to find defects and flaws and errors in communication and the shared understanding of the requirements for user stories. So we were able to actually find a lot of these issues more upfront and they got QA involved more upfront. So we broke out of the mini waterfall cycle to where the developers would code and code and code and then drop the functionality to the testers the last day or the last hour of the day. And then that would cause this vicious cycle of them finding an issue, the developers having to work all weekend to get them done. So, by having the conversations up front, the developers saw that, hey, this is a better quality of life for me to actually work and have a stronger partnership to where I can actually now go home and, play video games or, do whatever I want to do over the weekend.
All right, great. Okay, so we're about 7 minutes to the top of the hour, and that is all of the questions that we have. So I'm going to go ahead and close out the question and answer period of today's presentation. Thanks to everybody who submitted questions. They were, each and every one of them, awesome. So thank you again. Before we actually close things out, though, I know I promised at the top of today's webinar that we'd be doing a drawing for 3 $50 Amazon gift cards. So at this point, I would like to go ahead and do that drawing, and let's see, without further ado, our first winner is Charles Brown Roberts. Congratulations, Charles, you're our first winner. Our next winner is Matthew Lowe. Congratulations, Matthew. And our third winner today of the $50 Amazon gift card is Kavian Gohardes. I'm going to mess this up. I'm sorry. Gohardesdegashan. I'm sorry. It's a long last name, but congratulations, Kavian. Thank you all very much for being a part of today's webinar. Want to remind the audience that today's webinar has been recorded. So if you missed any or all of it, or if you just want to watch it again, you will have the opportunity to do so. Following today's webinar, we are sending out an email that will contain a link to access the webinar on demand. And the webinar is also going to be living on the devops.com website. So you can always find it there. So just go to devops.com/webinars and look in the on-demand section, and it should be right there waiting for you. Adam, thanks you so much for giving such a great presentation today. Judging from the number and the quality of the questions, good stuff, good stuff. So.
Absolutely. Well, thanks. I appreciate all the questions and I appreciate the opportunity.
Yes, yes, absolutely. And thank you, everybody who did join us today. And this is Charlene O'Hanlon, and I'm signing off. Have a great day, everybody.